Hey everyone, welcome back to Beast History. Today we're tearing down one of the most iconic, most enduring, and most completely wrong images in American history. Close your eyes for a second. Picture a cowboy. You see him, right? Leathery skin, dusty hat, sitting by a crackling campfire under a blanket of stars. And what's he eating? It's always the same thing. He's got a tin plate piled high with a sizzling, perfectly cooked steak and a heap of savory beans. It's the foundational scene of 1,000 movies, the very picture of rugged American freedom. It's simple, it's hearty, it's satisfying, and it's a total fantasy. The truth is, the story of what a cowboy actually ate on a long cattle drive has almost nothing to do with perfectly grilled steak or leisurely campfire dinners. The real story is so much stranger, so much more desperate, and frankly, so much more interesting. It's not a story about cuisine. It's a story about brutal, unforgiving logistics. It's a story of high-stakes economics, where every bite of food was measured against profit and loss. And more than anything, it's a story about human ingenuity pushed to its absolute limit. A drama that plays out in cast-iron pots and dusty flour sacks, 1,000 miles from anything you could call civilization. The real diet of the American cowboy wasn't a celebration of the open range. It was a monotonous, 3-month-long battle against starvation, spoilage, and the crushing tyranny of the bottom line. So forget the movies. Today, we're digging into the gritty, greasy, and agonizingly repetitive truth. This is what cowboys actually ate. To understand the plate, you first have to understand the paycheck. The entire era of the Great Cattle Drive, that brief, explosive period from the end of the American Civil War in 1865 to the late 1880s, wasn't born out of a love for adventure. It was born out of a massive, nationwide market imbalance. It was pure, unadulterated capitalism on the hoof. Here's the situation in 1866. Down in Texas, the Civil War has just ended. For years, while the men were off fighting, the cattle were left to their own devices on the vast, unfenced plains. And Texas Longhorns are survivors. They're tough, they're wiry, and they breed like crazy. So by the end of the war, the state is practically drowning in them. We're talking an estimated 5 million head of cattle roaming wild. There's so much beef in Texas that a full-grown steer is worth maybe $4, if you can even find a buyer. It's an asset, but it's a worthless one, stranded hundreds of miles from anyone who wants it. Meanwhile, up in the industrial north and east, the exact opposite is happening. The war effort has decimated their local cattle stocks. Cities like Chicago, New York, and Boston are booming with immigrants and factory workers, all of them hungry for beef. The railroads are expanding, creating new towns and new markets across the Midwest and West, places like Sedalia in Missouri or Abilene in Kansas. In these markets, that same $4 Texas steer could fetch $40, sometimes more. You don't have to be a Wall Street genius to see the opportunity there. A tenfold return on investment. The only problem is the 1,000-mile gap between the supply and the demand. There are no refrigerated train cars reaching down into the heart of Texas yet. The only way to get that product to market is to make it walk. And so the Great American Cattle Drive was born. It was a business proposition, plain and simple. A rancher or a consortium of investors would round up a herd of 2,000 to 3,000 longhorns, hire a crew of about a dozen men, a trail boss, a handful of cowboys, and a cook, and point them north. Their job was to move this massive, living pile of money across open country, facing storms, stampedes, river crossings, and hostile territory, all to cash in at a railhead town in Kansas, Nebraska, or Wyoming. Every single decision made on that 3-month journey was dictated by this financial reality. And the most critical decision of all, the one that governed the life and morale of every man on the trail, was what to pack for food. This is where the romance of the trail slams headfirst into the wall of reality. Let's call it the tyranny of logistics. Imagine you're the trail boss. You have to feed 12 hungry men, 3 meals a day for, let's say, 90 days. That's over 3,200 individual meals. You have to carry all of that food with you from day one, because out on the Kishom Trail or the Goodnight-loving Trail, there are no grocery stores. There are no farmers markets. There is nothing. So what are your constraints? First, weight. Everything you bring has to be hauled in a single wagon pulled by mules or oxen. Every pound of food is a pound your animals have to drag across 1,000 miles of rough terrain. You can't afford luxuries. You need maximum calories for minimum weight. Second, spoilage. There is no refrigeration. This is the 1870s. Ice is a fantasy. Anything that can rot will rot. Fresh vegetables, milk, butter, eggs, forget it. They'd be a soupy, disgusting mess within days. You need food that is shelf-stable for months in the blistering summer heat. Third, water. It's the most precious resource on the plains, and you can't guarantee you'll find it every day. So any food that requires a ton of water to cook is a liability. Fourth, fuel. You need to cook, which means you need fire. But what if you're crossing a stretch of plains with no trees? You can't exactly pack 3 months' worth of firewood in your wagon. Your fuel source has to be whatever you can find along the way. So the puzzle is this. Find food that is lightweight, non-perishable, water-efficient, and can be cooked with minimal, often unreliable fuel. When you look at it through that lens, the Hollywood menu of steak and beans starts to fall apart. A side of beef is heavy and spoils. A sack of dry beans is also heavy, and more importantly, it needs hours of boiling, consuming huge amounts of precious water and fuel. The entire enterprise of the cattle drive could succeed or fail based on solving this single logistical problem. An outfit with poorly planned provisions would have a crew that was weak, sick, and mutinous. A failed crew meant a lost herd, and a lost herd meant financial ruin. The West was littered with the bones of men who got this equation wrong. The men who got it right, the ones who turned those $4 steers into $40 windfalls, they weren't just great cowboys. They were logistical geniuses. And the greatest of them all, the man who essentially cracked the code of the cattle drive, was a grim, imposing Texan named Charles Goodnight. You cannot talk about the American West without talking about Charles Goodnight. If the cattle drive era had a Steve Jobs, it was him. Born in Illinois in 1836, he moved to Texas as a boy and grew up embodying every single cliché of the hardened frontiersman. He was a scout, a Texas Ranger, and he knew the vast, terrifying expanse of the Texas plains better than almost any man alive. He was tough, famously short-tempered, and possessed a mind that was constantly working, constantly optimizing. He saw the world not as a place of romance and adventure, but as a series of problems to be solved with ruthless efficiency. After the Civil War, Goodnight looked at the millions of worthless cattle in Texas and the hungry markets to the north, and he didn't just see an opportunity. He saw a system waiting to be engineered. His first famous drive, with his partner Oliver Loving in 1866, wasn't just a trip, it was a masterpiece of planning. They blazed a new, more arid but safer path west before turning north, a route that would come to be known as the Goodnight-loving Trail. But Goodnight knew that the key to scaling this operation, to making it repeatable and reliable, was solving the food problem. He needed a mobile, all-in-one, go-anywhere support vehicle. A kitchen, a pantry, a workshop, and a field hospital on wheels. And since nothing like that existed, he invented it. In 1866, using a tough, military surplus Studebaker wagon, Charles Goodnight created the single most important piece of technology in the history of the open range, the Chuckwagon. This thing was a work of pure genius. It looked simple, but every single element was born from hard-won experience. Goodnight started at the back of the wagon. He designed and built a large, slanted cupboard, what we now call a cabinet, and bolted it to the rear. This was the Chuck box. It was filled with small drawers and shelves, a place for everything and everything in its place. Spices, salt, sugar, flour, coffee, all had their designated spot, protected from the elements and the constant jostling of the trail. The front of this box was a hinged lid. When you parked for the night, you could swing this lid down, prop it up with a wooden leg, and it became the cook's workspace, a clean, stable countertop in the middle of nowhere. It was brilliant. But he didn't stop there. Underneath the main wagon bed, he slung a large, dried cowhide. This was called the coonie, or sometimes the possum belly. This was for carrying fuel. On the treeless plains, the only fuel was wood found along riverbeds, or more often than not, dried cow manure, what they called prairie coal. The cowboys would gather it as they went, tossing it into the coonie. On the side of the wagon, he attached a large wooden water barrel with a spigot, its contents more precious than gold. He added a toolbox for repairs, a jockey box for miscellaneous gear, and even tucked away basic medical supplies, turning the wagon into the outfit's de facto ambulance. The heavy cast-iron Dutch ovens, pots, and pans were stored inside, along with the bulk provisions. Sacks of flour, green coffee beans, salt pork, and whatever else the trail boss had deemed essential. The Chuckwagon wasn't just a kitchen. It was the heart of the entire operation. It was the mobile command center, the rolling headquarters that made the whole endeavor possible. It dictated the pace of the drive. The herd could only move as far as the wagon could travel in a day. It was the social center of the camp, the place the men gathered for the brief moments of rest they were allowed. The invention of the Chuckwagon transformed the cattle drive from a desperate, haphazard gamble into a structured, repeatable industrial process. And at the absolute center of this universe, reigning over his wheeled kingdom, was the single most important man on the crew next to the trail boss himself, the cook. If your image of a trail cook is some lowly, bumbling servant, you need to throw that idea out the window right now. The trail cook, known universally as Cookie, was a god. He was often the second highest paid man on the drive, earning more than the veteran cowboys, and for good reason. His job description went far beyond just preparing meals. First, he was the driver of the Chuckwagon. Every morning, he had to rise hours before anyone else, in the pitch black, around 3 a.m. He'd start the fire, get the coffee brewing, and prepare breakfast. As the cowboys ate, he was already washing up and packing his entire kitchen back into the wagon. Then, while the cowboys started the herd moving, Cookie would drive the wagon ahead, pushing his mule team hard to get several miles in front of the tens of thousands of plodding hooves. He had to pick the spot for the midday meal, a place with, hopefully, water and grass. He'd unpack, cook a full meal, serve it, and as soon as the men were done, he'd pack it all up again, race ahead of the herd again, and pick the spot for the evening camp. It was a grueling, relentless 14 to 16-hour day, every single day for 3 months straight. But that was just the driving and cooking. He was also the camp doctor. His chuck box contained turpentine, quinine, and salves. He was the one who dug out splinters, bandaged wounds, and dosed out castor oil for digestive ailments, a very common problem on the trail. He was often the navigator, using the sun and landmarks to guide the entire outfit toward the next water source. He was the camp barber, the letter writer for illiterate cowboys, and sometimes even the banker, holding the men's wages for safekeeping. Because of this immense responsibility, the cook wielded almost absolute power. His mood set the tone for the entire camp. A cheerful, competent cook meant a happy, efficient crew. A foul-tempered, lazy cook, what they called a belly cheater, could make life a living hell and sow dissent that could wreck a whole drive. His workspace around the Chuckwagon was his sacred, sovereign territory. There was an ironclad, unwritten law of the plains. You do not ride your horse through another man's kitchen. Doing so was a profound sign of disrespect that could get you fired on the spot, or worse, get you a beating with a skillet. The area around the fire and the wagon was a sanctuary. After a long day in the saddle, it was the only piece of home these men had, and the cook was its fierce, undisputed ruler. He decided who got the first cup of coffee. He decided who got an extra biscuit. And if you got on his bad side, he could make sure your portions were small and your chores were miserable. The cowboys feared the trail boss, but they respected and obeyed the cook. This structure, a mobile base of operations run by an autocratic but essential master of logistics, was the system that made the whole cattle kingdom function. It was a solution born of brutal necessity, and it created an environment where the most powerful man in a cowboy's day-to-day life wasn't the one with the fastest gun, but the one holding the coffee pot. The trail cook's authority was absolute. He could deny a man food, assign brutal chores, and his mood could make or break the entire crew's morale for weeks on end. This autocratic rule was often seen as a necessity for survival in a lawless land, a way to maintain order and discipline when the nearest sheriff was 500 miles away. But was it a justifiable system for maintaining order, or was it a form of frontier tyranny that went against the very idea of cowboy freedom? What do you think? Let me know your honest opinion in the comments below. Now, with the Chuckwagon established as the operational heart and the cook as its undisputed king, let's pry open that chuck box and look at the actual fuel that powered this entire enterprise. If you were a cowboy on a long drive, your entire culinary world, your entire sensory existence for 3 straight months, revolved around a monotonous but sacred trinity of staples. These were the 3 things you could count on, day in and day out: coffee, sourdough, and beef, but not in any way you would recognize today. This trinity wasn't about pleasure. It was about survival, and each element tells its own story of ingenuity, desperation, and the brutal realities of the trail. Our journey into this diet starts where the cowboys' day started, in the frigid, pitch-black darkness of 3:30 in the morning. The first sensation of the day wasn't the sight of the rising sun. It was the sound of cookie-grinding coffee beans, and the smell that soon followed, a rich, roasted aroma cutting through the cold plains air. The first words of the day were almost always the same, a gravelly yell from the cook, "Come and get it." And what you came to get was coffee. But this was not the carefully crafted, artisanal beverage we obsess over today. Trail coffee was a blunt instrument. It was a drug, a stimulant, a necessary jolt to get a man who'd slept on the hard ground for 4 hours back into the saddle for a 16-hour workday. The cowboys called it 6-shooter coffee or gunpowder coffee, and the legend was that it was strong enough to float a pistol. That might be an exaggeration, but not by much. The process was brutally simple. Cookie would haul out a massive, soot-blackened coffee pot, dump in a generous amount of coarsely ground coffee, and fill it with water from the barrel. He'd bring it to a rolling boil over the campfire, letting the grounds and water churn together into a thick, potent sludge. There were no filters. There was no delicate pour-over technique. To settle the grounds, a cook might throw in a crushed eggshell if he had one, or a splash of cold water, but more often than not, a cowboy's tin cup was full of a liquid that was hot, black, bitter, and gritty. You learned to sip carefully to avoid a mouthful of grounds, a technique they called straining it through your mustache. It was often drunk black and unsweetened. Sugar was a precious commodity, and a wise cook rationed it carefully. The purpose of this coffee wasn't to be savored. It was to be absorbed. It cut through the morning chill, sharpened the senses for the dangerous work of handling a half-awake herd, and provided a moment of warmth and ritual before the sun even crested the horizon. It was the first and sometimes only comfort of the day. Now, for most of American history up to that point, coffee was a difficult provision to haul long distances. It was typically sold as green, unroasted beans. This meant that every night, the cook would have to perform the delicate, frustrating task of roasting the beans over an open fire. It was incredibly easy to screw up. A few seconds too long, and you had a batch of useless, charred cinders. Not long enough, and you had weak, grassy-tasting coffee. It was a daily variable in a life that desperately needed constants, And this is where a story of American industrial genius intersects with the dusty trail. Two brothers from Pittsburgh, John and Charles Arbuckle, saw this problem and engineered a revolutionary solution. They were coffee and spice merchants, and in the 1860s, they patented a process that would change the West forever. They developed a chemical glaze, a mix of egg whites and sugar, that they applied to the coffee beans during the roasting process. This glaze sealed each bean in a protective, airtight shell. The result was Arbuckles Ariosa coffee. It was the world's first pre-roasted, pre-packaged coffee sold in a standardized 1-pound bag. For the trail cook, this was a miracle. No more nightly roasting, no more guesswork. Every single bag of Arbuckles was the same. You could buy it in Texas, open it 2 months later in Wyoming, and it would be as fresh and aromatic as the day it was packed. The sturdy paper bags with their iconic red and yellow label, featuring a soaring angel, became a symbol of reliability in an unreliable world. But the Arbuckle brothers weren't just brilliant engineers, they were brilliant marketers. They understood their customer. Inside every single 1-pound bag of Arbuckles coffee, they included a stick of peppermint candy. For a man living on a diet of salt and grease, that small, sweet, refreshing stick was an unbelievable luxury. It was a tiny taste of civilization, a personal treat in a world of communal hardship. Even more ingeniously, every bag contained a signature coupon. On the side of the bag, there was a picture of the founder, John Arbuckle. Cowboys, many of whom were illiterate, would just call them Johns. They would save these coupons religiously. Arbuckles put out a whole catalog of premiums you could get by redeeming them. A few coupons could get you a quality handkerchief. A dozen might get you a new pocket knife or a razor. Save up enough and you could get a new hat, a pair of boots, or even, for the truly dedicated, a wedding ring. The brand became so ubiquitous, so deeply woven into the fabric of Western life, that cowboys were often called Arbuckle drinkers. Arbuckles wasn't just coffee. It was a currency, a status symbol, and the fuel that powered the entire cattle kingdom. It truly was the coffee that won the West. After the first jolt of coffee, a cowboy needed calories. Serious, heavy, gut-filling calories to burn through a long morning in the saddle. And those calories came from one primary source, the second member of our holy trinity, sourdough. If the Chuckwagon was the heart of the camp, then the sourdough starter pot was its soul. This wasn't just an ingredient. It was a living, breathing member of the crew and the cook's most sacred responsibility. Let's demystify what it is. A sourdough starter is a simple flour and water paste that has been colonized by wild, airborne yeast and a friendly bacteria called lactobacillus. The wild yeast is what makes the bread rise, and the lactobacillus produces lactic acid, which gives it that distinctive tangy, sour taste. More importantly, that acid acts as a natural preservative, slowing down the growth of mold and bad bacteria. In a world without preservatives or refrigeration, this was a form of chemical magic. Every trail cook had his own starter, housed in a dedicated crock or wooden keg. It was a living thing that needed to be cared for constantly. Every time the cook used some of the starter to make dough, he had to feed what was left, adding more flour and water to replenish it. He had to keep it at the right temperature. On a hot day, he'd have to keep it in the shade, maybe wrapped in a wet cloth. On a cold night, it was not uncommon for a cook to take the starter keg into his own bedroll with him, using his body heat to keep the precious yeast culture from dying. If a cook's starter died, it was a catastrophe. It meant no bread, no biscuits, no anything until he could either get a new starter from another outfit, a rare and lucky occurrence, or try to create a new one from scratch, a process that could take days and was by no means guaranteed to work. A cook was judged on the quality of his coffee and the reliability of his sourdough. Losing his starter was a mark of shame and incompetence. The primary use for this living dough was, of course, the sourdough biscuit. And let's be clear, these were not the light, flaky, buttery biscuits of a southern kitchen. Trail biscuits were functional. They were dense, heavy, and built for durability. The cook would mix a portion of his starter with flour, salt, and maybe some lard or bacon grease if he had it. He'd knead this tough dough on the tailgate of his chuckwagon, form it into rounds, and place them in a large, heavy, cast-iron pot with a tight-fitting lid. The Dutch oven. The Dutch oven was the other key piece of trail technology. It was a portable oven. The cook would place it directly on a bed of hot coals from the fire, and then shovel more hot coals onto the flat, lipped lid. This created an even, radiant heat from both above and below, allowing him to bake in the middle of an open prairie. The result was a batch of hot, crusty, and incredibly dense biscuits. They were the bread of the trail, served at every single meal. A cowboy might eat 6 or 8 of them at a sitting. They'd spear them with a fork, slather them with molasses or lick, or use them to sop up the grease from whatever meat was being served. They were the caloric foundation upon which the entire day was built. This versatile starter was also used for flapjacks, a welcome variation for breakfast, creating thick, tangy pancakes that were a perfect vehicle for molasses. But day in and day out, it was the biscuit, a constant, reliable, unchanging brick of carbohydrates. It wasn't exciting, but like the coffee, it was essential. It was a piece of living history, a culture that was kept alive, day after day, by the careful hands of the cook, a symbol of continuity and life in a vast and desolate landscape. So we have our bitter, life-giving coffee. We have our dense, tangy sourdough. Now we come to the protein, the main course. And this is where we encounter the single greatest, most agonizing irony of the cowboy's entire existence. Here you have a dozen men, surrounded, day and night, by a sea of beef. 2,000 prime longhorn steers, a walking, mooing steakhouse stretching for a mile in every direction. They were literally swimming in a river of potential ribeyes, T-bones, and tenderloins. They must have eaten like absolute kings, right? They must have feasted on the finest steaks in America every single night. Wrong. Completely, utterly, tragically wrong. The cowboys on a cattle drive were condemned to eat the worst, toughest, and most undesirable beef in the entire country. To understand this painful paradox, you have to go back to the fundamental economics of the drive. Remember that $40 price tag waiting in Kansas. That price was for a live, healthy, full-grown steer. The herd was not a pantry. It was the cargo. It was money on the hoof. A trail boss was under immense pressure from the rancher, or the investors who owned the herd, to deliver the maximum number of cattle to market in the best possible condition. Every animal that didn't make it was a $40 loss. So the idea of killing a perfectly healthy, prime animal for food was financial insanity. You don't burn your paycheck to keep warm, and you don't eat your profit margin for dinner. So, where did their meat come from? It came from the culls, the rejects, the animals that weren't going to make it to market anyway. Every cattle herd had what was known as the drag, or the drag tail. These were the weakest, oldest, or slowest cattle that would lag at the very rear of the column. Pushing them along slowed the entire herd down, and many of them were unlikely to survive the full 1,000-mile journey. These were the animals designated for the cook. Alternatively, if a steer broke its leg in a gopher hole or was gored in a fight, it had to be put down. That animal would then become supper. Now, Texas longhorn beef was already known for being significantly leaner and tougher than the corn-fed beef we're used to today. But the meat from these drag animals, it was a whole other level of bad. This was meat from a creature that was already skinny, old, or sickly. It was stringy, gristly, and often had very little fat, which meant it had very little flavor. This was not the marbled, tender beef of fine dining. This was survival-grade protein, and it took all of the cook's skill to make it remotely edible. The first step was to try and tenderize it. This was often done through brute force. A cook might take a steak, what they grimly called trail steak, and pound it relentlessly with the back of an axe head or a heavy mallet, physically breaking down the tough muscle fibers. After that, The only real solution was long, slow cooking. The meat was cut into chunks and thrown into a Dutch oven with some water and a lot of salt, and left to simmer for hours and hours, slowly breaking down the connective tissue until it was soft enough to be chewed without breaking your teeth. Out of this necessity, a few staple dishes emerged. One of the most common was a simple, greasy stew, often just called son-of-a-gun stew, though we'll get to its more infamous cousin later. It was beef simmered into submission, maybe with some onions or canned tomatoes if the cook was feeling generous. But perhaps the most quintessential trail dish, the one that perfectly embodies the philosophy of using every last scrap, was a concoction called kush. Kush was the ultimate leftovers meal. The cook would take whatever cooked beef was left over from a previous meal, chop it up into a fine hash, and throw it into a hot, greasy skillet. Then he'd take any stale, leftover sourdough biscuits, crumble them into pieces, and add them to the pan. He'd pour in a generous amount of beef tallow, rendered fat, and fry the whole mess together, stirring it until it became a sort of thick, savory, greasy mush. It was a way to combine the two main food groups of the trail, tough beef and hard biscuits, into a new hot meal, while ensuring that not a single calorie went to waste. It might not sound appetizing, but after 12 hours in the saddle, a plate of hot, salty, fatty kush would have tasted like a gift from heaven. This was the agonizing reality for the man who became the symbol of the American beef industry. He spent his days defending it, moving it, and caring for it, but he was forbidden from ever truly enjoying it. He was the architect of a beef-crazy nation, yet he was forced to subsist on its toughest, most undesirable scraps. The gap between the myth of the cowboy, enjoying his fireside steak, and the reality of him choking down a plate of greasy kush is the story of the cattle drive in a nutshell. It's the story of a romantic image built on a foundation of grueling, unromantic, and deeply ironic hardship. We've established the monotonous, foundational trinity of the trail diet: brutally strong coffee, dense sourdough biscuits, and the agonizingly tough beef from the herd's weakest members. That was the baseline, the predictable rhythm of consumption for weeks on end. But life on the trail was anything but predictable. The journey was a constant tightrope walk between scarcity and opportunity, and the cowboy's diet reflected that. When provisions ran low or a different kind of opportunity presented itself, the menu could shift from monotonous to downright shocking. This is where we move beyond the staples and into the world of desperate measures, clever improvisations, and the rare, fleeting taste of luxury. This is the story of what cowboys ate when the Trinity wasn't enough. And there is no better or more visceral place to start than with the most infamous, most mythologized, and most stomach-churning dish in the entire lexicon of the American West. A dish whose name alone is a testament to its raw, unfiltered frontier origins. We're talking about son-of-a-bitch stew. Now, that's not just a colorful nickname. That was its actual name, spoken in plain language around the campfire. Sometimes, for more delicate company, it might be called son-of-a-gun in a sack, but the original name stuck for a reason. It was a meal born of pure, unadulterated pragmatism, a complete rejection of waste in a world where every calorie was a victory. And to understand it, you have to understand its very specific origin story. The stew could only be made under one condition: when a calf was available. Sometimes a pregnant cow in the herd would give birth on the trail. That newborn calf, unable to keep up with the pace of the drive, was a liability. It couldn't be sold at market. It couldn't be left behind. So it became a contribution to the outfit's larder. The calf would be dispatched, and the cook would prepare a feast that used, quite literally, everything but the moo. This is where modern sensibilities might want to check out, but this is the unvarnished reality of survival. The philosophy behind son-of-a-bitch stew is what we today fashionably call nose-to-tail eating. For the trail cook, it wasn't a trendy culinary movement. It was just common sense. Wasting meat was a sin. Wasting the most nutrient-dense parts of an animal was just plain stupid. So what went into the pot? First, you had the variety meats, or what we'd call offal. The heart sliced thin. The liver, a huge source of iron and vitamins. The tongue, a surprisingly tender cut. The kidneys. All of this was standard butcher's fare. But the stew didn't stop there. It went deeper. It included the sweetbreads, not bread at all, but the thymus gland from the calf's throat, a delicate and prized morsel. It also included the brain, which was often scrambled with the calf's own suet, or fat, to create what they called prairie butter, a rich, fatty addition that added flavor and calories. But the real secret ingredient, the one that gave the stew its legendary status and its unforgettable richness, was something called the marrow gut. This wasn't the intestine, as the name might suggest. The marrow gut was the long tube connecting a nursing calf's two stomachs. Because the calf had only ever consumed its mother's milk, this tube was filled with a thick, white, cheesy-tasting substance that was partially digested milk, chyme, and digestive enzymes. To the cowboys, this was pure gold. When added to the stew, the contents of the marrow gut would break down, thickening the broth into a rich, creamy, savory gravy. It was a natural sauce, a thickener, and a flavor bomb all in one. All of these ingredients, the heart, the liver, the tongue, the brains, the sweetbreads, and the marrow gut, were chopped up and thrown into a large Dutch oven. They were seasoned heavily with salt, pepper, and maybe some chili if the cook had it, and slow-cooked for hours until all the different cuts of meat were impossibly tender, and the broth had become a thick, complex, and incredibly nourishing gravy. It was served hot, ladled over sourdough biscuits. For the cowboys, a son-of-a-bitch stew was a feast. It was a radical break from the monotony of stringy, dry beef. It was packed with flavors and textures they hadn't experienced in months. More importantly, it was loaded with vitamins and minerals, iron, B vitamins, and others that were desperately lacking in their normal diet. It was a potent dose of preventative medicine against the creeping fatigue and illness of the trail. The stew was a visceral embodiment of the frontier ethos. Use everything, waste nothing, and don't be squeamish about it. It was survival, served in a bowl. Now that we've covered the most shocking meal, let's address the other half of that great cinematic lie. The beans. In almost every Western movie, a plate of steak is always paired with a mountain of beans. We've debunked the steak. So what's the truth about the beans? The truth is, while beans were absolutely a staple of Western life, they were surprisingly uncommon on a long-distance cattle drive. The reason, once again, comes down to pure logistics. Think back to our constraints, water and fuel. Dry beans, typically pinto beans, are a fantastic food source. They're shelf-stable and packed with protein. But to make them edible, they need two things in massive quantities: water to soak and boil them, and time, hours and hours of simmering over a fire. On the trail, both of those things were precious resources. A cook couldn't afford to use several gallons of water from the barrel to boil beans when the next reliable river might be 2 days away. He also couldn't afford to keep a fire burning for the 4 to 5 hours it took to get a pot of beans tender, consuming his limited supply of prairie coal. It was simply an inefficient use of resources. The caloric return on investment just wasn't worth the water and fuel cost. So where does the myth come from? Beans were a core food for cowboys in almost every other context except the long drive. At a permanent ranch headquarters, where there was a well for water and a steady supply of firewood, beans were on the menu constantly. They were the go-to food for ranch hands doing daily work. They were also a staple for line riders, cowboys who lived in small, remote line shacks for months at a time to watch over a specific section of a large ranch's territory. In those fixed locations with more predictable resources, beans were the perfect, cheap, long-lasting food. The image of the cowboy eating beans got conflated. The life of a ranch hand got mixed up with the life of a trail driver, and Hollywood, loving the simple, rustic image, just ran with it. So while a cowboy certainly ate his fair share of beans in his lifetime, that iconic plate of beans by the campfire on a 1,000-mile trek to Kansas. Mostly a myth. It was a luxury they simply couldn't afford. The monotonous diet of beef and biscuits was a physical and psychological grind. Any break from it was a cause for celebration. And sometimes, the harsh landscape of the plains offered up a gift. These were moments of pure luck, when the cowboys' diet could be supplemented by what they could hunt or gather. Hunting was a rare but cherished opportunity. The primary job of the cowboy was to manage the herd, not to be a hunter. Firing a gun could spook the cattle and cause a catastrophic stampede, so indiscriminate shooting was strictly forbidden. However, the trail boss or the cook, riding ahead of the herd, was in a prime position to spot game. If a herd of antelope or a group of mule deer was spotted far enough away from the cattle, the boss might give the signal for a quick, careful hunt. A successful hunt was a game changer. Antelope meat, in particular, was prized. It was tender, flavorful, and a world away from the stringy longhorn beef. It would be brought back to the Chuckwagon in triumph, where the cook would prepare it with reverence. He'd fry up fresh steaks, a luxury beyond imagination, or create a rich stew that didn't require 8 hours of boiling to be palatable. Smaller game was also a possibility. Prairie chickens, sage grouse, or wild turkeys could add variety to the pot. These meals were feasts, talked about for days afterward. They were a reminder that the land wasn't just an obstacle to be crossed. It was a living ecosystem that could, on occasion, provide a bounty. Foraging offered smaller, but no less welcome pleasures. As the drive moved north, the seasons would change, and different plants would come into fruit. In the spring and early summer, cowboys might find patches of wild onions or garlic, which the cook would eagerly chop up and add to his stews, bringing a sharp, fresh flavor to an otherwise dull dish. Later in the season, they might come across wild plums, grapes, or chokecherries along a riverbank. These would be eaten raw and on the spot, a burst of tart sweetness that was a shocking contrast to the salty, greasy trail diet. In some parts of Texas and Oklahoma, they might pass through groves of pecan trees, gathering up nuts that could be a snack or a crunchy addition to a rare dessert. These were not reliable food sources. An outfit couldn't plan their provisions around the hope of finding a plum thicket. But these small, found treasures were powerful morale boosters. They broke the monotony, provided a taste of something fresh and alive, and connected the men to the land in a way that the monotonous plodding of the herd did not. It was a small act of grace from a land that was otherwise profoundly unforgiving. If foraged fruits were a gift, then the items the cook kept locked away in the chuck box were a form of currency. These were the luxuries, the provisions that were carefully rationed and guarded with the ferocity of a dragon protecting its hoard. These were the ingredients that separated a basic, survival-level cook from a truly great one who knew how to lift the crew's spirits. Chief among these were dried fruits. Sacks of dried apples, peaches, or apricots were a common sight in a well-stocked chuckwagon. They were relatively lightweight, wouldn't spoil, and could be rehydrated to create a semblance of dessert. A cook could stew them with some sugar to make a simple fruit compote, a sweet, tangy treat that was a perfect antidote to a salty meal. Even better, he could use them to make a spotted pup or a trail pudding. This was a simple suet pudding, a dense cake-like mixture of flour, lard or suet, sugar, and spices like cinnamon or nutmeg, with a handful of rehydrated dried fruit mixed in. This dough would be bundled in a cloth sack and boiled in a pot of water for a couple of hours. The result was a heavy, dense, but incredibly sweet and satisfying dessert, a rare indulgence for a birthday or after a particularly hard river crossing. The other key luxury was the sweetener. The most common was molasses, which they called lick. It was transported in a large keg and was doled out by the cook to be drizzled over flapjacks or biscuits. It provided a powerful hit of sweetness and calories. Canned goods were another high-status item. Because of their weight, they were used sparingly. Canned tomatoes were a cook's secret weapon, adding acidity, moisture, and a depth of flavor to an otherwise bland beef stew. Canned corn or peas could also make a rare appearance, their bright, sweet flavor a shocking novelty. These items, the dried fruit, the molasses, the spices, the canned goods, were the cook's spice rack in his treasure chest. He knew that a surprise dessert or a more flavorful stew could turn a sullen, exhausted crew into a happy and motivated one. The strategic deployment of these luxuries was a key part of his job. They were a tool for managing morale, a way of reminding the men, through taste, that a better, sweeter world existed somewhere beyond the endless dust of the trail. The cowboys who ate son-of-a-bitch stew did so out of pure necessity, using every part of an animal to survive. Today we call this nose-to-tail eating and praise it as sustainable and ethical. But for them, it was a gritty, desperate act, a meal cooked up from a creature that was essentially a casualty of the journey. So here's the question. Is a meal like this a testament to the unbreakable human spirit of pragmatism, a genius solution to the problem of survival? Or does it represent a line of desperation you simply couldn't cross, no matter how hungry you were? Be honest, could you stomach it to survive? Let me know what you think in the comments. So we've lived the life. We've woken up to the bitter coffee, choked down the dense sourdough biscuits, and survived on a monotonous diet of tough beef and desperate stews. We've experienced the rare joy of a wild plum and the strategic morale boost of a molasses-soaked flapjack. For 2, 3, sometimes 4 grueling months, this has been the entire sensory world of the cowboy. But the trail doesn't go on forever. Every dusty mile, every dangerous river crossing, every monotonous meal has been leading to one single destination. And it is here, at the end of the line, that our story of food reaches its dramatic and explosive climax. This is the story of the reward, the reckoning, and the revolution that brought the entire era to a sudden and definite close. Imagine the change. For 90 days, the only sounds you've heard are the plodding of hooves, the lowing of cattle, the whistle of the wind, and the crackle of a campfire. The only thing you've smelled is dust, sweat, leather, and manure. The only people you've seen are the same 11 faces, day after day. Your world has been a slow-moving ocean of grass under an endless sky. And then one day you smell it on the wind first. It's the smell of coal smoke. Then you hear it, a faint, high-pitched whistle, a train. Suddenly, on the horizon, a cluster of wooden buildings appears, shimmering in the heat. You've made it. You've arrived in a Kansas cow town. Towns like Abilene, Dodge City, or Ogallala were parasites on the cattle trade. They exploded into existence for the sole purpose of meeting the railroad and separating the cowboy from his wages. As the herd was driven into the shipping pens to be loaded onto cattle cars bound for the Chicago stockyards, a profound transformation took place. The cowboy, who for months had been a quasi-monastic figure, a disciplined laborer in a world without temptation, was about to be paid. After the trail boss settled up with the cattle broker, he would pay his crew their wages in cash. Maybe $100 for 3 months of brutal work, a small fortune at the time. With that money burning a hole in his pocket, the cowboy was released from his duties. He was a free man in a town built entirely to cater to his every pent-up desire. The sensory overload was staggering. The chaotic noise of piano music spilling from a dozen saloons, the clatter of wagons, the shouts of merchants, the laughter of painted ladies. The sight of 2-story buildings, glass windows, and people in clean clothes. It was a different universe. And while the saloons, gambling halls, and brothels were certainly high on the list of priorities, for many cowboys, the very first stop was not for a whiskey, but for a meal. The first meal. This first meal was a ritual. It was a ceremony. It was the symbolic and literal payoff for every plate of greasy kush, every tough-as-leather trail steak, every gritty cup of coffee. The cowboy would stride into one of the town's new restaurants or hotel dining rooms, establishments that existed purely to serve men exactly like him. He sat down not on the hard ground, but in a real chair, at a real table with a tablecloth. And he ordered. And what did he order? Everything he had been deprived of. The menus of these cowtown eateries tell a fascinating story. One of the most sought-after and extravagant first courses was oysters. It seems insane, fresh seafood in the middle of landlocked Kansas in the 1880s. But this was a potent status symbol. The oysters were packed in barrels of ice, shipped west from Baltimore on the very same railroads the cattle were about to take east. To eat an oyster in Dodge City was to taste the coast, to taste the sophisticated world you had just connected yourself to. It was the ultimate anti-trail food. Next would come the eggs, mountains of them. Fried, scrambled, boiled, it didn't matter. On the trail, eggs were a fantasy. Here you could have a dozen if you wanted, and they would be served with bread. Not dense, tangy sourdough biscuits, but light, fluffy white bread baked in a proper oven. And on that bread you could put butter. Real, creamy, yellow butter. For a man who had been using bacon grease or beef tallow as his only fat for months, the taste of fresh butter was a revelation. It was a luxury so profound it's hard for us to even comprehend. But all of that was just the appetizer. The main event, the entire purpose of the exercise, was the steak. This was the moment the great irony of the cowboy's life was finally resolved. After spending a quarter of a year delivering prime beef to the nation while eating its garbage, he could finally have his share. He would order a steak, a thick, beautiful slab of beef from a properly raised, corn-fed animal. It would be cooked not by a grumpy trail cook over a smoky dung fire, but by a professional chef on a cast-iron stove. It would be tender, it would be juicy, it would be marbled with flavorful fat. It would be everything the trail steak was not. This meal was a catharsis. It was a cowboy consuming his own success. He was literally eating the profits of his labor. The first glorious, tender, flavorful bite of that steak was the culmination of the entire journey. It was the taste of victory, the taste of civilization, the taste of a job well done. It was the final, satisfying closing of the loop that had begun with a $4 steer in the dusty scrubland of South Texas. The celebratory feast in the cow town was a glorious, but temporary, reprieve. Once the cowboy's money was spent and he headed back to Texas to do it all over again, he returned to the same old diet. And that diet, year after year, took a serious and undeniable toll on his body. Life on the trail was a nutritional disaster, and the physical price the cowboys paid was steep. The most insidious and widespread ailment was one we rarely think of today: scurvy. Scurvy is a horrific disease caused by a severe deficiency of vitamin C. It leads to weakness, gum disease, tooth loss, anemia, and poor wound healing. Without vitamin C, the body's connective tissues literally begin to dissolve. On a diet of coffee, flour, and salted meat, there was virtually no vitamin C to be had. The cowboys' main protection, whether they knew it or not, was the offal they ate in dishes like son-of-a-bitch stew. Organ meats like liver contain a small but significant amount of vitamin C, enough to stave off the worst effects of the disease. But it was a constant threat. Cowboys often suffered from what they called prairie disease, which was likely a form of scurvy, characterized by bleeding gums, loose teeth, and overwhelming lethargy. Their dental health in general was atrocious. The combination of a low-calcium diet, the lack of vitamin C, and the sheer grit and dust that got into everything they ate wore their teeth down to nubs. A 30-year-old cowboy often had the teeth of an old man. The cook's Chuck box pharmacy contained oil of cloves for toothaches, but there was no real cure for the underlying decay. And then there were the digestive issues. A diet incredibly high in grease and salt and incredibly low in fiber was a recipe for constant gastrointestinal distress. Constipation was a chronic problem, which the cook would treat with his go-to cure-all: a massive dose of castor oil, a famously violent laxative. The cowboys called it green apple quickstep, and it was an experience to be dreaded. The constant imbalance in their diet led to a life of physical discomfort that was simply accepted as a part of the job. The rugged, healthy image of the cowboy belied a reality of chronic pain, disease, and malnutrition. The trail cook wasn't just a chef. He was the first and only line of defense against a diet that was actively trying to kill the men who ate it. The era of the Great Cattle Drive, with its unique culture, its logistical challenges, and its terrible food, was a spectacular but short-lived phenomenon. It exploded out of the unique economic conditions of the post-Civil War era, but it was killed with shocking speed by two simple and revolutionary American inventions. The forces that ended the cowboys' reign weren't rival cattle barons or hostile tribes. They were a strand of wire and a line of steel. The first killer was barbed wire. For centuries, the Great Plains had been an open sea of grass, a public commons through which a herd could be driven with relative freedom. But in 1874, an Illinois farmer named Joseph Glidden patented a design for cheap, practical, and brutally effective barbed wire. This simple invention changed the West forever. Homesteaders, farmers, and ranchers could now affordably fence off their land, protecting their crops and pastures from the trampling hooves of 2,000 longhorns. The open range was being chopped up, one property line at a time. The great cattle trails that had been the arteries of the industry were being choked off by mile after mile of sharp, unforgiving wire. A trail boss could no longer just point his herd north. He had to navigate a maze of fences, often leading to violent conflicts with settlers known as the fence-cutting wars. The era of the free and open range was ending. The second and even more decisive killer was the railroad itself, the very entity the cattle drives were meant to serve. As the Gilded Age roared on, railroad construction pushed relentlessly across the continent. The iron horse was no longer just waiting at the end of the trail in Kansas. It was pushing its tentacles deeper and deeper into the heart of Texas. With the expansion of the rails came the next great innovation, the refrigerated rail car. Perfected in the late 1870s and early 1880s, the refrigerated car made the entire logic of the cattle drive obsolete. Why walk a steer 1,000 miles, a process in which it would lose weight and risk death, when you could slaughter it in Texas, dress the beef, and ship it north in a climate-controlled car? It was cheaper, it was faster, and it delivered a higher quality product to the booming eastern markets. Meatpacking plants, pioneered by titans like Gustavus Swift and Philip Armour, began to spring up in Texas cities like Fort Worth. The business was no longer about moving live animals. It was about processing and shipping dressed beef. The twin pressures of barbed wire and the refrigerated rail car were insurmountable. By the late 1880s, the great long-distance cattle drives were largely a thing of the past. The industry had evolved. The cowboy's job changed from being a long-haul driver to being a ranch hand, a fencer, a man who worked within a specific, contained territory. The epic 3-month journey across the continent, the very thing that had defined the cowboy and his diet, had vanished. The entire era, which had burned so brightly for just over 2 decades, was over. And so we come back to that image we started with, the lone cowboy, a plate of steak and beans, the romantic symbol of American freedom. It's a powerful myth, but the truth, as we've seen, is infinitely more complex and far more compelling. The real story of what a cowboy ate is not about food in the way we think of it. It's a story about the brutal calculus of capitalism, where a man was surrounded by a feast he was forbidden to touch. It's a story of incredible logistical ingenuity, of a mobile kitchen on wheels and a living, breathing bread starter that had to be kept warm in a bedroll. It's a story of human endurance, of men who survived and worked on a diet so monotonous and unhealthy it would cripple a modern person in weeks. The bitter coffee, the dense sourdough, the stringy beef, the desperate organ-filled stews, these weren't just menu items. They were artifacts. They were the edible evidence of a unique and fleeting moment in history. The taste of a cowboy's meal was the taste of the West itself. Harsh, monotonous, unforgiving, and just occasionally touched by a moment of unexpected, life-affirming grace. It was the taste of reality, and it tells a far more powerful story than any Hollywood myth ever could. And that's where the story of what a cowboy truly ate comes to its dramatic close. If you enjoyed this dive into the past, do us a huge favor and hit that like button and subscribe to Beast History so you don't miss what's next. We've got so many more insane stories ready for you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.